An assault weapon's only purpose is to kill people efficiently.
The government announced it was taking steps to ban what it considers to be military-style assault rifles.
It is a potential life saved, a non-fatal shooting avoided.
Double down on it and work overtime to strip her citizens of their otherwise inalienable right.
The Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, Mr. President, as you well know.
They say that when we argue for removing weapons of war from the streets of America, we're actually telling them to repeal the Second Amendment.
Was bragging and boasting around the fact that they were the toughest gun regulations in the entire United States.
After the recent election in November, Oregon's Measure 114 became the new it thing, and the state was claiming that it had the strictest arm laws in the entire country. The ongoing debate over arm control. Arm control, which refers to a variety of regulations and actions intended to control the use of weapons, is still at the focus of contentious debates between proponents and opponents of stronger gun legislation as the incidence of mass casualties in America rises. We addressed some important questions on the subject to aid in understanding the discussion and its political and social ramifications. Everywhere in the world, governments have frequently implemented new control measures in the wake of horrific incidents. Mass situations are less frequent. Self-hurt also has a tendency to decline.
An assault weapon's only purpose is to kill people efficiently.
They are obsessed with attacking law-abiding Americans' Second Amendment liberties.
Semi-auto arms, similar to those used by the British gunmen who claimed the lives of 16 people in 1987, were outlawed in that nation. Following the 1996 infamous school incident, it did the same with the majority of pistols. It currently has one of the lowest rates of arm-related fatalities among wealthy nations. A 1996 tragedy in Australia led to mandated gun buybacks, where according to some estimates, up to 1 million weapons were later melted into slag. The frequency of mass incidents fell. Only the U.S. has repeatedly resisted tightening arm regulations in response to mass incidents, whose frequency and intensity are unmatched outside of combat zones. Research has refuted a variety of explanations that have been put up to explain why there are so many incidents in the United States, such as the country's particularly untamed society, class and racial divides, or its poor mental health treatment system. The enormous amount of arms available in the nation remains to be a strong factor, though. In 2009, America had an armed self-hurt rate of 33 per million people, significantly higher than the norm for wealthy nations. It was 5 per million in Canada and 0.7 per million in Britain, which also reflects disparities in arm ownership. Because of a number of early 1990s movies that depicted urban gang shenanigans, Americans may perceive this as a manifestation of their country's greater criminal issues. A groundbreaking study conducted in 1999 by Franklin E. Zimring and Gordon Hawkins of the University of California, Berkeley, found that while crime rates are higher in the U.S. than in other developed nations, this is not necessarily the case. Instead, they discovered that American crime is just more fatal, according to data that has now been repeatedly corroborated. For example, while both New Yorkers and Londoners are equally likely to be robbed, the New Yorker has a 54 times greater chance of losing their lives in the process. They came to the conclusion that, like so many other anomalies of American rage, the gap was filled by arms. In almost every axis, including across industrialized nations, American states, American towns and communities, and even controlling for crime rates, more arm ownership is correlated with more self-hurt. A new study of 130 studies from 10 nations found that laws restricting the use of arms tend to lower the number of passings. This implies that the destruction is brought on by the arms themselves. Every mass incident is, in a way, a fringe event, motivated by singular elements, like the assailant's beliefs or personal circumstances. It is impossible to completely remove the risk. However, countless studies that have examined the outcomes of measures, like Australia's and Britain's policies, have corroborated the record. Fewer arms end up in the hands of private persons as a result of countries' stricter control laws, which reduces violence. Federal and state gun control laws. In the U.S., control laws are a complex interplay between federal and state regulations, with federal laws serving as a baseline for arm restrictions. Private sellers at events like arm fairs or online marketplaces are not mandated to conduct background checks, but licensed dealers must ensure that their customers are not prohibited persons, such as felons or individuals with a history of domestic problems. Additionally, federal law imposes severe restrictions on certain arms, like fully auto rifles. The most recent federal legislation, passed in response to a tragic incident in Uvalde, Texas, increased background checks for purchasers under 21 and closed the boyfriend loophole. It also strengthened existing restrictions on straw purchases, buying arms on behalf of prohibited individuals, and the trafficking of arms. Buyback programs in the United States. Buyback schemes are short-term initiatives that offer rewards, such as cash or gift cards, to persuade people to turn over arms to law authorities, usually without asking any questions. Governments or private organizations frequently host these activities in police stations, places of worship, and community centers. Collectibles are either destroyed or stored. A nonprofit organization devoted to preventing misuse, most programs aim to remove arms from public spaces, offer a secure location for disposing of firearms, and incite cultural changes in a community.
A lot of firepower on this table today, and each and every one of these guns.
The government announced it was taking steps to ban what it considers to be military-style assault rifles. It
is a potential life saved, a non-fatal shooting avoided.
The first official buyback program was implemented in Baltimore in 1974 as a result of the incident of 3 police officers, according to the authors of the book Why We Are Losing the War on Armed Violence in the United States. More than 13,000 arms were gathered as part of the campaign, but the city's unrest remained unabated. Since then, hundreds of other repurchase initiatives have been implemented across the country. Bill Clinton established the first federal arm buyback program in the country in 1999. The $15 million initiative gave funds to police forces for the purchase and destruction of arms up to the amount of $500,000. After the Bush administration called for the initiative to be terminated, the Senate rejected attempts to continue funding it 2 years later. Although some anti-violence and anti-arm activists favor buyback schemes, there is no evidence that they are effective. According to a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, a private charity, buyback programs implemented in American cities had no effect on reducing crime or self-induced passings involving arms. The majority of those who participated in such initiatives came from low-crime regions, and the arms that were frequently collected were either outdated or not in excellent functioning shape. Evidence suggested that towns set the sale price of arms too low in order to significantly limit the supply of weapons. The author of one chapter in the book, Why We Are Losing the War on Armed Violence in the United States, Dr. Brendan Campbell, a pediatric surgeon at Connecticut Children's Medical Center, suggested that for buyback programs to be more successful, they need to collect a lot more arms than they do at the moment. Dr. Campbell suggested that they had to charge more for rifles and handguns as well. Those are the ones that are most likely to be used in crime, as well as by those making self-hurt attempts, he said. If you just give $100 for whatever gun, that's when you'll end up with all these old rusted guns that are low risk of causing harm in the community. Other countries have implemented mandatory buyback programs. Australia implemented a widespread buyback scheme after a mass incident there in 1996, collecting between 1/3 and 1/2 of all privately owned arms. The endeavor mainly focused on semi-auto rifles and several shotguns that were now illegal due to new rules. After an attack on mosques in Christchurch in 2019, New Zealand prohibited military-style semi-auto arms, rifles, and some parts. It also launched its own extensive buyback program. According to the authorities, the initiative resulted in the collection of more than 56,000 illegal arms from around 32,000 individuals. U.S. public stand. Expanded background checks for purchases are frequently supported by more than 80 or 90% of respondents in polls. Long-standing support for stronger controls among Americans as a whole. A ban on the creation, ownership, and sale of semi-auto arms was supported by 55% of respondents in a June Gallup poll.
Here's the amount of gun violence that has happened. I think we're reaching a tipping point where we're about to hit desensitization to gun violence.
Double down on it and work overtime to strip her citizens of their otherwise inalienable rights.
The majority of respondents were also in favor of other policies, such raising the minimum age for purchasing some arms and instituting a 30-day waiting period before selling one. However, as time goes on, the spikes in support for control that follow mass incidents also have a propensity to return to the partisan mean. According to Gallup poll results, participant support for stronger arm legislation decreased from 66% in June, only weeks after the mass incidents in Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, to 57% in October. Following the incident at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, a PDK poll indicated that 72% of Republicans and only 24% of Democrats favored arming teachers. Political realities and public support. According to polls, the majority of Americans support arm control laws. Nevertheless, in Washington, legislation is frequently stalled, and Republicans rarely appear to suffer political consequences for their resistance. According to Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota, the rationale behind Republicans' consistent opposition to any new arm laws, even in the face of horrific incidents like the one in Uvalde, Texas, is a rather straightforward one. The first-term Republican had a simple response when asked what his constituents' reaction would be if he were to endorse any serious level of control. "Most would probably throw me out of office," he said. His statement sheds light on why Republicans have fought ideas like the one for mandatory background checks for purchasers of arms, despite the fact that such programs enjoy extremely high levels of public support, up to 90% nationwide in certain circumstances. Republicans like Mr. Cramer are aware that supporting legislation to restrict access to arms, even attack-style weapons, would not bring them any political benefit.
The Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, Mr. President, as you well know,
phase of its plan to get rid of assault-style firearms. It'll be in the form of a buyback program.
But they are aware that if they voted for or even expressed support for safety regulations, they would undoubtedly face criticism and, more than likely, who may cost them their jobs. No matter how much blood is shed in classrooms and school halls across the nation, the majority of Republicans in the Senate represent fervently conservative states where possessing an arm is regarded as a sacred right protected by the Constitution. Democrats claim that even though the National Rifle Association has recently suffered from scandal and financial difficulties, the organization still exerts significant influence over Republicans through financial support and contributions, strengthening the party's opposition to any new laws. There is another explanation, though, besides the influence of the arms lobby, rural states' disproportionate importance in the Senate, and single-voter issues. The resounding support predicted by national polls was absent when voters in 4 Democratic-leaning states had the chance to pass additional background checks on arms or ammunition. Democrats find the tale to be both scary and recognizable. National survey results that demonstrate resounding support for their policy aims have long given progressives courage, only for them to discover that these results don't always transfer to Washington legislation and popularity on Election Day or elsewhere. For instance, while Americans feel President Biden has not accomplished much and his approval ratings have fallen into the low 40s, several of his key policy proposals are well received. It's possible that the poll's seeming progressive political majority is merely an illusion. Following mass incidents, public support for additional arms regulations typically increases. There is already evidence that after the unfortunate events in Buffalo and Uvalde, popular support for stronger legislation has increased once more. Even if popular support for such restrictions usually wanes afterward, these incidents could nevertheless result in a long-lasting change in attitudes. However, the dismal results for background checks indicate that the public may not be as strongly in favor of arm regulation as polls would have us believe. Their votes indicate otherwise. Strictest gun laws by state. There are not many federal laws in the United States that govern the selling of arms. There have been efforts to pass federal control legislation, especially in the wake of the Sandy Hook Elementary School incident. However, a lot of legislators still believe that the Second Amendment forbids any kind of control. Some accessories, such as large-capacity mags, are outlawed at the federal level. The majority of the time, states are in charge of enforcing arms restrictions. There are few or no arms regulations in several American states. Open carry laws are among the most permissive laws, allowing open carrying of an arm in public. Other states only permit concealed carry.
They say that when we argue for removing weapons of war from the streets of America, we're actually telling them to repeal the Second Amendment.
Either openly or concealed within cities or counties.
Before buying an arm, some of the harshest restrictions mandate that the buyer pass a background check and receive training. The state with the tightest arm prohibitions is California, which also has the 7th lowest rate of fatal incidents. California's laws also provide funding for neighborhood initiatives that have decreased arm-related incidents, in addition to restrictions on who may buy an arm and what kinds of arms are authorized to possess. Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Hawaii, Maryland, and Massachusetts are additional states with strong prohibitions. Before a person is authorized to buy one in some of these states, they must pass training requirements, background checks, and wait periods. For instance, Massachusetts requires those who want to buy one to get permission from their local police department. The paperwork, interview, and background check alone for this process might take weeks. Even after that, the police chief retains the right to refuse the license. Once a license has been obtained, the buyer must show the license to the retailer and pass additional background checks. It should come as no surprise that states with the tightest prohibitions typically have the lowest rates of ownership. The lowest rates of ownership in the U.S. are in Massachusetts and New Jersey, 14.7%, Hawaii, 14.9%, and New York, 19.9%. Maryland has the highest rate of ownership among the 8 states, with at least an A-, with 30.2%. Additionally, states with stringent regulations and minimal ownership had much fewer fatalities. The lowest demise rate is 3.4 per 100,000 persons in Massachusetts, followed by 4.8 in Hawaii and 5.2 in New Jersey. Mississippi, Louisiana, New Mexico, Alabama, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, Arkansas, Missouri, and Tennessee have the laxest arms regulations. Armed violence continues to be a major source of mortality nationwide, so many states are attempting to pass legislation to encourage arms safety. States that do not have strict laws surrounding many states with strict laws. As a result, people frequently bring arms into the country illegally from nearby states. Check your state's rules and make sure you abide by them if you wish to purchase one. You may get into a lot of problems if you bring one into the country from a state with laxer laws. Whether you support control or not, you likely have strong opinions regarding the subject of laws. However, keep in mind that the main goal of gun regulations is to increase public safety. Therefore, following them is in everyone's best interests. Recent developments in Oregon legislation. Measure 114 gained significant attention following the November election in Oregon due to its extraordinary control provisions. At the time, Oregon was touting itself as having the strictest laws in the country. However, these laws were subsequently overturned at the state level by a judge, whose identity will become evident as this issue resurfaces. A new court date is approaching, so let's delve into the details. The source for this information is an AP piece, but the focus will be on a returning sponsor referred to as News and their article titled "Oregon Judge to Decide in New Trial Whether Voter-Approved Control Law is Constitutional." This return is prompted by the positive response from the audience, and it's seen as a valuable benefit. The coverage of this topic is widespread, with 24 different sources reporting on it. Notably, the biased distribution of these sources appears to be balanced, spanning from the center-left to the mid-right. The news source, described as independent media, is characterized by high factuality and a left-leaning stance. It serves as an alternative for those seeking clarity in their news consumption and aims to hold the media accountable. Before delving into the Oregon case, it's essential to distinguish between state-level and federal-level issues. The federal case involves a judge referred to as Immergut, who interpreted the law in a way that was seen as making it her own and declaring it constitutional.
Your right to own a gun can also be restricted.
The federal one is with the Judge Immergut, who did the mental gymnastics, who just made it her own and said it was constitutional.
Meanwhile, the state-level case involves a judge named Oath, who similarly applied her interpretation and deemed the state's arms legislation constitutional. In recent developments, the Oregon firearms legislation has faced temporary blocking by a judge from Harney County. Legal battle over Oregon's Measure 114. The Oregon Department of Justice has indicated its intent to dispute the ruling. At that time, a Harney County judge issued a temporary restraining order that halted the implementation of a voter-approved firearm measure scheduled to take effect. This TRO was issued by Circuit Court Judge Robert Raccio in response to a lawsuit filed by Arm Owners of America, based in Virginia, and a related organization called the Arm Owners Foundation, along with Joseph Arnold and Cliff Asmussen, both arm owners in Harney County. The lawsuit sought to block Measure 114, which aimed to ban the sale of high-capacity mags and establish a permit system for arm purchases, requiring buyers to complete a training course with a law enforcement certified instructor. This development raises significant concerns among owners and advocates, as the same judge who granted the TRO and indicated its likelihood of success for the plaintiffs will also preside over the subsequent legal proceedings. This situation creates a complex legal landscape with conflicting perspectives on the issue. In essence, Measure 114 imposes several requirements on ownership in Oregon. It mandates that individuals undergo a criminal background check and complete a safety training course to obtain a permit for purchasing an arm. Additionally, the measure prohibits high-capacity mags capable of holding more than 10 rounds. A noteworthy aspect of this controversy is the state's argument that high-capacity mags are unnecessary for self-defense, as a 10-round mag would suffice. Critics of the measure argue that it infringes on the right to bear arms, requiring individuals to obtain a permit for a right they inherently possess. At the federal level, Judge Immerget previously ruled in favor of certain restrictions, comparing them to concealed carry regulations. However, this comparison may not hold, as it pertains to arm ownership, which is distinct from concealed carry. The significance of this case extends beyond Oregon's borders. If the state-level decision contradicts the federal one, it could create legal confusion and potentially impact regulations nationwide. Similar themes of conflicting ruling have emerged in other states, like Illinois and New Mexico, where such laws have faced legal challenges.
So we teamed up with a gun rights group that refuses to compromise on the Second Amendment to fight alongside us.
They are coming for your guns. They're listing them out in this extensive legislation.
In summary, the ongoing legal battle surrounding Measure 114 in Oregon has far-reaching implications for regulations, and it underscores the tension between state and federal perspectives on arm control. The outcome of this case could have a ripple effect on arm policies across the United States. Individual rights versus public safety in the Measure 114 case. The situation at hand in the Measure 114 case, as argued by J.R. Tony Aiello, revolves around fundamental issues of individual rights to bear arms and the right to self-defense. It's emphasized that this legal challenge isn't primarily concerned with public safety, public health, or broader societal concerns. Instead, it centers on the assertion that the rule doesn't unreasonably interfere with individual rights and constitutes an appropriate legislative response to public safety concerns, particularly in scenarios involving mass incidents. The defense's argument appears to be a complex one. On one hand, they claim that the rule doesn't constitute extreme infringement, but rather reasonable regulation. However, there's a counter-argument that the defense is attempting to downplay the infringement by presenting it as a mere irritant rather than a significant restriction. In essence, the defense is navigating a fine line in justifying the measure while addressing the fundamental right to bear arms. Drawing a parallel to the New Mexico governor's actions, it's noted that the suspension of arm rights, if not termed as a permanent ban, raises concerns. The issue of language and semantics in such cases is seen as a tactic.
Measure 114 was the new hotness after the last election in November in Oregon.
Either openly or concealed within cities or counties.
Was bragging and boasting around the fact that they were the toughest gun regulations in the entire United States.
To navigate legal challenges. The plaintiffs in this case are also expressing concerns about potential delays in obtaining the necessary licenses to purchase arms. The defense contends that the licensing procedure shouldn't take more than 30 days, but this assertion raises questions about whether such delays could be seen as infringements on individual rights. This situation echoes a recent verbal ruling in New Mexico, where a judge emphasized that rights cannot be infringed, regardless of the duration, whether short-term or long-term. These interconnected issues highlight the complexity of the legal landscape surrounding arm regulations and individual rights. The Measure 114 case, along with related cases in other states, underscores the ongoing debate over how to balance public safety concerns with the protection of constitutional rights. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.